Somewhere beneath the streets of New York City, in the long-ago dark of a January night, a man sat alone in a hotel room with the windows shut against the cold, not sleeping, not quite waking, but listening to something no one else could hear. Outside his window, the heavy, quiet snow was gently falling, slowly gathering on the iron fire escapes and the wide awnings, wrapping the endless rush and noise of the great metropolis in a thick, peaceful blanket. The distant sounds of the avenue, the soft rumble of a late automobile, the muffled footfalls of weary travelers, the low, steady hum of the city breathing all, seemed to fade away into a comforting, rhythmic murmur. Inside the room, the air was warm and perfectly still, illuminated only by the gentle, unwavering glow of a single electric lamp on the bedside table. The man resting in this quiet space was Nikola Tesla, and while history would remember him as a towering intellect who reshaped the modern world, in this solitary late-night hour, he was simply a person. He was a man of quiet, daily rituals and profound imagination, someone solitary and deeply unusual, yet carrying a gentle, sensitive spirit beneath his formal demeanor. His life had been a vast, unfolding dream of extraordinary visions, as he possessed a mind that could see the unseen, shaping light and invisible energy from the very air around him. Yet, for all his breathtaking and miraculous gifts, he was a man who ultimately gave those gifts away, freely and completely, offering his life's labor to a world that did not always know how to return the favor. He poured his brilliant light into the foundations of our modern lives, sometimes at great and painful personal cost, walking away from enormous wealth and comfort so that the future might be brighter for those he would never meet. As we join him in the calm, sheltering atmosphere of this winter night, allow your own body to sink deeply into that same sense of undisturbed rest. Let your breathing slow, finding a steady, unhurried rhythm that matches the falling snow drifting softly past the glass. Notice the quiet warmth of the space around you, and let the heavy, peaceful darkness hold you safely, just as it held him. There is absolutely no urgency here, nowhere else you need to go, and nothing more you are required to do. You can simply lie back and listen, letting your thoughts drift, scatter and settle, much like the delicate snowflakes resting upon the empty, silent streets. Tonight, we will gently wander through the memories of a life that was constantly looking toward the light. We will trace the quiet, winding path of a mind that dreamed of connecting the earth. But we will not rush, and we will not hurry. We will move slowly, carried softly by the slow current of time, finding rest in the shadows of the past. And so, as your eyes grow heavier and the present moment fades into a comfortable, inviting slumber, far away from the towering steel and the endless electric hum of the city we leave behind, and deep within the folding green embrace of the Velebit Mountains, there lies a small, quiet village called Smiljan. It is a place woven entirely out of old, peaceful memories, resting gently in the rural heart of what was then the Austrian Empire, and what is today known as Croatia. If you were to close your eyes and picture it now, you might see a landscape painted in warm, rich earth tones, where the deep green of the forests meets the soft, rolling amber of the fields. The air here is mountain air, crisp and unhurried, carrying with it the fragrant, grounding smell of ancient pine trees and the damp, sweet perfume of midsummer rain soaking deeply into the soil. Just beyond the edge of the village, the cool, clear waters of the river Lika wind their way slowly through the valley, murmuring a quiet, constant song over the smooth stones. It was in this secluded, idyllic setting, sheltered by the mountains and guided by the slow rhythms of nature, that a mind of unimaginable depth first opened to the world. On the 10th of July, in the year 1856, surrounded by the quiet hum of the rural night, Nikola Tesla was born. The story goes that his arrival coincided with a beautiful, fierce summer storm that rolled slowly across the darkened peaks, casting great silent webs of lightning across the sky and illuminating the sleeping valley below in sudden, brilliant flashes of pale blue light. It was a fitting, quiet welcome for a boy who would spend his life unraveling the mysteries of that very same light. The household into which he was born was one of quiet faith, deep study, and gentle domestic rhythm. His father, Milutin, was a Serbian Orthodox priest, a man of profound solemnity and quiet dignity. Milutin was bookish and formal, deeply devoted to a life of learning, and he possessed an extensive library filled with heavy, leather-bound volumes that smelled faintly of old paper, dust, and time. You can almost picture him sitting in his study as the evening light begins to fade, turning the thick textured pages of a book, while the distant comforting sound of church bells is carried softly on the mountain wind, marking the peaceful passage of another rural afternoon. Milutin hoped that his son might eventually follow in his quiet footsteps, entering the church to live a life of spiritual reflection. Yet, as much as Nikola respected his father's world of books and faith, it was from his mother, Yuka, that he inherited the spark of creation. Yuka was a woman of extraordinary quiet brilliance, who possessed a mind just as remarkable as the one her son would eventually unveil to the world. Though she had never received a formal education and could neither read nor write, her mind was a vast, perfectly organized library of its own. She could recite thousands of lines of ancient epic poetry entirely from memory, her voice rising and falling in the warmth of the firelight as she wove tales of old heroes and distant lands. But her genius was not limited to memory alone. Tesla was an inventor in her own quiet right. With her skilled, tireless hands, she designed and built intricate household tools, crafting mechanical looms and subtle time-saving devices from the simple materials she found around the farm. Young Nikola would sit for hours, watching his mother's hands move with absolute precision, observing how she could take ordinary pieces of wood and twine and turn them into something useful, something moving, something entirely new. Her fingers worked with a steady, rhythmic grace, tying knots, carving joints, and smoothing rough edges until a perfect tool emerged from her imagination into reality. It was a beautiful, practical magic, and Nikola absorbed every detail of it, learning silently that the world was not just something to be lived in, but something that could be carefully, thoughtfully shaped. The early years of young Nikola's life were spent enveloped in the warm, protective embrace of this mountain valley, exploring the forests, watching the animals, and sharing the innocent golden days of childhood with his siblings, especially his older brother, Dane. Dane was a bright and deeply loved boy, the pride of the family, and the two brothers spent their days immersed in the simple, profound discoveries of the natural world. That even the most peaceful landscapes are sometimes touched by the cool shade of sorrow, and the tragic early passing of his older brother Dane cast a long, quiet shadow over the family and over the gentle rhythm of Nikola's early childhood. In the quiet years that followed, as the family learned to live within the soft, enveloping quiet of their loss, young Nikola began to retreat further into the vast, uncharted landscapes of his own mind. It was during these solitary hours, wandering through the fields or resting quietly in his room, that the early signs of an entirely unusual inner life began to surface. He slowly became aware that his mind did not work quite like the minds of those around him. He was deeply, profoundly sensitive to the physical world, to the subtle vibrations of sound, the delicate shifts in temperature, and the intricate, hidden patterns of the natural environment. Most notably, he began to experience incredibly vivid mental imagery. When a word was spoken, he would instantly see the object it described floating in the air before him, so fully formed and real that he often had to pass his hand through the vision to ensure it was not physically there. Sometimes, these images were accompanied by sudden, blinding flashes of light, a phenomenon that both fascinated and overwhelmed him. He began to pay obsessive attention to the way light moved, the way a sudden spark could illuminate the dark, the way energy seemed to hum and vibrate beneath the surface of all living things. These visions were not frightening. Rather, they were the early, quiet stirrings of a lifelong conversation with the invisible forces of the universe. As we linger here in the fading light of this 19th century Serbian village, let the peacefulness of Smiljan wash gently over you. Imagine the sun slowly dipping below the Velebit Mountains, casting long, soft shadows across the wooden floors of the Tesla home. The air cools, the wood smoke from the evening fires begins to drift lazily into the twilight sky, and the sound of the river Lika fades into a gentle, continuous whisper. Allow yourself to rest in this warm oil paint memory, feeling the heavy, comforting blanket of the evening settling over the house, the village, and the boy who is quietly watching the stars begin to appear one by one in the vast, darkening sky. There is no rush to leave this place. The world here is small, safe, and deeply familiar. The scent of drying herbs hangs faintly in the kitchen, and the soft murmur of his parents' voices can be heard from the next room, a low, rhythmic comfort that signals the end of the day. As the night deepens, the wind outside rustles softly through the branches of the great pine trees, singing a slow, ancient lullaby that has echoed through these mountains for centuries. Everything is in its place. Everything is quietly at rest. As the golden, sunlit days of his early youth gradually began to fold into the quiet turning of the years, the time came for Nikola to step away from the gentle, sheltering embrace of the mountain valley. The path of his education led him first to the nearby town of Karlovac, where he attended the higher real gymnasium, walking along unfamiliar streets that were paved with stone and shadowed by taller buildings. Here, away from the endless forests and the soft murmuring of the river Lika, he began to immerse himself fully into the vast, structured world of mathematics and physics. The transition into Karlovac was marked by the shifting seasons, the deep greens of the mountain pines giving way to the autumn golds and muted browns of the town's surrounding landscape. The air felt different here, thicker and filled with the scent of wood smoke drifting from hundreds of stone chimneys as the villagers prepared for the approaching winter. Nikola would spend hours walking along the quiet edges of the town, watching the frost slowly gather on the window panes in the early mornings, marveling at the delicate, geometric perfection of the ice crystals. His sensitivity to the physical world remained as acute as ever, and every changing breeze, every shifting shadow seemed to speak to him in a silent, comforting language. By the autumn of 1875, this quiet pursuit of knowledge carried him further away, over the borders of his childhood, and into the formal, historic avenues of Austria, where he enrolled at the Graz Polytechnic Institute. You can almost see the imposing stone facades of the university buildings, rising tall and solemn against the overcast autumn sky. The corridors were wide and echoing, lined with heavy wooden doors and stone steps that had been worn smooth by the slow, steady passage of countless students over the decades. As winter slowly approached, the atmosphere of the institute grew deeply contemplative, wrapped in a blanket of cold mountain air that settled heavily over the city. Inside the lecture halls, the pale winter light filtered through tall, arched windows, casting long, soft shadows across the wooden desks. The air in those rooms carried a distinct, unforgettable texture, a mingling of dry chalk dust, the smell of aged leather bindings, and the faint, earthy scent of damp wool from the heavy winter coats of the young men who gathered there to study. For Nikola, the institute was not merely a place of learning. It was a vast, quiet sanctuary where his mind could finally stretch out and explore the boundless territories of science. His capacity for academic absorption was nothing short of legendary, an extraordinary, silent phenomenon that amazed those who witnessed it. The library at Graz became a second home to him, a vast repository of human knowledge, where the air was forever cool and silent. He would trace his fingers along the spines of ancient books, feeling the textured leather and the embossed gold lettering, pulling down volumes of advanced mathematics and physics that had been untouched for years. He possessed a mind that did not simply read information, but rather drank it in entirely, absorbing entire textbooks with the effortless grace of dry earth receiving the autumn rain. He could read a page once and hold it in his memory perfectly, visualizing the text and the diagrams as if they were physically suspended in the air before him. His daily routine became a testament to his unmatched dedication, rising in the quiet, undisturbed hours of the very early morning, long before the sun had even begun to warm the horizon, and working continuously by the soft, yellow light of a solitary lamp until late into the night. He was driven by a quiet, persistent hunger to understand the hidden mechanics of the universe, moving through his studies with a profound and solitary focus. Yet this extraordinary brilliance carried with it a delicate, unseen weight, and his time at Graz was marked by a quiet, shifting rhythm of profound contradictions. His flawless academic performances, which earned him the highest possible marks and the deep, silent respect of his professors, were frequently followed by periods of intense, overwhelming exhaustion. He pushed himself to the very edges of human endurance, living almost entirely within the ceaseless, demanding engine of his own thoughts. A subtle undercurrent of melancholy began to weave its way through his days. a quiet loneliness that often accompanies those who perceive the world with such unique intensity. There were times when the sheer volume of his ideas became too heavy to carry, forcing him to retreat to the quiet sanctuary of his small boarding room where he would rest in the dim light, allowing his overtired senses to slowly recover from the barrage of information and the endless stream of vivid waking dreams. His professors, recognizing both his genius and his fragility, occasionally sent gentle, concerned letters to his father, worried that the young man was giving too much of himself to the quiet, consuming fire of his studies. It was during his second year at the institute that a moment of quiet, profound clarity arrived, quietly altering the course of his life and the future of the world. In a physics class, led by Professor Poschel, the students were gathered to observe a newly arrived piece of equipment from Paris, a Graham dynamo, a machine capable of operating both as a motor and a generator using direct electrical current. As the professor engaged the machine, it began to spin, filling the quiet room with the mechanical hum of early electrical engineering. But as it turned, the wire brushes that maintain the electrical contact sparked and flared violently, protesting against the friction and the inefficiency of the design. Nikola watched the sparking light with his usual deep, unbroken concentration, and in that quiet moment of observation, he sensed instinctively that something about the machine was fundamentally flawed. He gently suggested to the professor that perhaps the sparking commutator could be eliminated entirely if the machine were powered by alternating current, a flowing, reversing wave of energy rather than a continuous, forced stream. The professor dismissed the idea immediately, devoting an entire lecture to explaining why such a concept was physically impossible, comparing Nikola's suggestion to the pursuit of a perpetual motion machine. But this rejection was not a dramatic confrontation. It was merely a quiet, unbridgeable gap between the accepted boundaries of the present and the unseen possibilities of the future. Nikola did not argue or raise his voice. He simply retreated back into his own thoughts, returning to his seat while the sparking machine continued its noisy, inefficient labor. Deep within his mind, however, the seed of a lifelong preoccupation had been firmly planted. He knew with a calm and absolute certainty that he was right. He did not yet know how to build the motor he saw in his mind, but the vision was there, waiting patiently in the quiet depths of his imagination, resting until the time was right for it to be brought out into the light. The heavy, exhausting toll of his continuous study eventually caught up with him, and his time at Graz came to a quiet, unresolved end. Struggling beneath the weight of his own relentless expectations, he left the institute without completing his degree, slipping away quietly into a period of wandering and reflection. His path eventually led him to the ancient, winding streets of Prague, a city of towering spires, old stone bridges, and a deep, philosophical melancholy that seemed to perfectly match his own internal state. Prague in the late 1870s was a city caught beautifully between the ancient world and the modern era, and the cobblestone streets echoed softly with the footsteps of philosophers, artists, and dreamers. The fog would roll in from the river in the late afternoons, softening the hard edges of the buildings and wrapping the city in a muted, gray stillness. Nikola found a strange comfort in this quiet melancholy. He would sit for hours in small, dimly lit cafes, listening to the soft murmur of conversations, his thoughts wandering freely through the abstract realms of metaphysics and literature. As he walked slowly along the misty banks of the Vltava River, watching the water drift endlessly beneath the arches of the Charles Bridge, he began to develop a growing, peaceful awareness of his own nature. He was slowly coming to understand that his mind worked differently from the minds of everyone else he had ever met. This realization was both a remarkable gift and a quiet, heavy burden. The vivid images that flashed before his eyes, the deep intuitive understanding of unseen forces, the way he could run a machine entirely in his imagination and know exactly where it would show, wear and tear, these were not just the talents of a clever student, but the manifestations of a truly singular existence. As he lingered in Prague, wrapped in a long wool coat against the damp river chill, he began to make peace with the beautiful, solitary nature of his own brilliance. As we leave him there, walking slowly through the quiet, fog-draped streets of the old city, let your own mind continue to drift and settle. Feel the comforting weight of the darkness around you, and allow the gentle, rhythmic turning of these old memories to smooth away any remaining tension in your thoughts. Just as the young inventor learned to embrace the quiet, wandering path of his own journey, you too can simply let go of the need to arrive anywhere at all. There is only the soft sound of the river, the distant chiming of an old city clock, and the peaceful, unbroken calm of the night, holding you gently as you drift further and further into deep, undisturbed rest. As the quiet, contemplative months in Prague slowly drifted to a close, the winding current of his life carried the young inventor onward to the sweeping elegance of Budapest. It was the early days of 1881, and the city was awakening to the new rhythms of a changing century. He had come to take up a position at the central telephone exchange, stepping into a world that was suddenly filled with delicate webs of copper wire and the soft, ghostly voices of strangers traveling invisibly across the wide expanse of the city. For a mind so deeply attuned to the unseen forces of the world, the telephone exchange was a place of quiet, endless fascination. He spent his days surrounded by the rhythmic clicking of switchboards and the low, steady hum of operators, his hands working deftly with the equipment, while his thoughts wandered far beyond the physical walls of the building. He was constantly searching for ways to refine the machinery, his imagination always looking for methods to make the invisible flow of energy smoother and more elegant. But the unyielding engine of his mind had been running for too long without rest, and the heavy toll of his continuous, solitary focus finally asked for its quiet repayment. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, a profound and overwhelming exhaustion began to settle over his fragile frame, pulling him away from the busy waking world and into a period of deep, involuntary retreat. His body, which had always been a highly tuned instrument, suddenly became painfully sensitive to the ordinary textures of daily life. The ambient noises of the city, the gentle shifting of light, the very air around him. Everything became too much to bear. This was not a dramatic collapse, but rather a slow, overwhelming heightening of his senses, as if the protective filters of his mind had simply washed away. The soft, distant ticking of a pocket watch from 3 rooms away sounded in his ears with the heavy, ringing clarity of a church bell. The ordinary footfalls of people walking on the pavement outside his window felt to him like the slow, rhythmic tremors of an earthquake, vibrating upward through the floorboards and deep into his bones. Even the gentle, ambient light of a cloudy afternoon felt impossibly heavy, stinging his eyes and forcing him to retreat into the comforting, shadow-filled sanctuary of a darkened room. He lay there for many long, quiet days, wrapped entirely in the stillness, allowing his deeply overtaxed nervous system to simply rest in the dark. If you can, imagine the profound, heavy stillness of that room and allow your own senses to soften and dim alongside his. Feel the comforting weight of the darkness wrapping around you, shielding you from the brightness and the noise of the outside world. There's absolutely nothing you need to listen to, nothing you need to look at, and no effort required from you. The world outside can simply wait. Just as he had to let go of his relentless, demanding thoughts and allow his body to sink into the repairing quiet, you too can allow the edges of your awareness to gently blur and fade. Let your breathing slow, matching the quiet, unseen rhythm of a room comfortably shut away from the world. Recovery did not come quickly, but it came softly, arriving in small, quiet increments as the heavy tide of his exhaustion slowly began to recede. The painful sharpness of the world gradually softened back into its normal, manageable contours, and he found himself able to bear the light of the late afternoon once again. His return to the waking world was greatly aided by the gentle, steadying presence of a good friend, Anatol Szigeti, who gently coaxed the young inventor out of his darkened room. Together, they began to take long, unhurried walks through the wide, tree-lined avenues of Budapest in the late afternoons, letting the cool, calming air of the approaching evening wash over them. The physical act of walking, of putting one foot gently in front of the other while the world slowly turned around them, brought a deep and necessary grounding to his restless mind. He began to feel the quiet strength returning to his limbs, and the frantic, overwhelming rush of his thoughts began to settle back into a clear, peaceful stream. It was during one of these restorative evening walks that the world would suddenly and quietly shift forever. They had found their way to the city park, a sprawling, peaceful expanse of green that offered a quiet refuge from the stone and noise of the streets. The day was slowly drawing to a close, and the setting sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, turning the vast open sky into a breathtaking canvas of deep, rich copper and soft, dusty rose. The air had grown perfectly still, carrying that unique, golden clarity that only arrives in the final, lingering moments of the daylight. They were walking slowly along the dirt paths, the leaves rustling very faintly in the evening breeze, when Nikola, feeling a sudden surge of quiet joy at the beauty of the shifting light, began to recite poetry. He had always loved the sweeping, philosophical verses of Goethe's Faust, holding the lines perfectly in his vast memory. And now, as the sun bathed the park in a warm, fading glow, the words flowed effortlessly from his lips. He spoke the lines softly, watching the sun inch closer to the edge of the earth, surrendering himself entirely to the peaceful rhythm of the poem and the quiet majesty of the evening. And then, in the midst of a spoken line, as smoothly and naturally as a flower opening in the quiet of the morning, it happened. There was no sudden shock, no dramatic strike of lightning, no frantic search for paper. It was simply an unveiling, a sudden, absolute, and perfect clarity. While looking into the setting sun, the complete vision of the alternating current motor, the rotating magnetic field that he had been searching for since his days in the lecture halls of Graz, materialized flawlessly in his mind. He stopped walking. He stood perfectly still on the path, his eyes fixed on the empty air in front of him, seeing something that no one else in the world could see. It was beautifully, elegantly simple. He saw the magnetic fields, turning in perfect, harmonious synchronization, pushing and pulling without friction, without sparking, without any of the clumsy mechanical limitations of the past. The invisible forces of nature were dancing before him in a flawless, silent waltz. He took a small stick and crouched down, drawing the diagram slowly into the soft dirt of the path, so that his friend could see the shape of what had just been born. The diagram in the dirt was quiet and unassuming, just a few sweeping lines in the dust, but it was the exact blueprint of a machine that would eventually go on to light up the entire world. It is difficult to imagine what it must feel like to hold something so impossibly vast and entirely unseen within the quiet confines of one's own mind. For a long while afterward, he carried this breathtaking vision quietly, nurturing it, turning it over and over in his imagination. He could see every wire, every coil, every subtle rotation of the field, and he could run the machine continuously in his mind, knowing with absolute certainty that it would work perfectly. Yet, there was a profound and gentle loneliness in this knowledge. He was carrying a piece of the future in his pocket, a brilliant, invisible secret, but he lacked the physical materials and the financial support to bring it out of the dirt and into the physical world. He realized, slowly and with a quiet sense of inevitability, that the grand old cities of Eastern Europe could not provide the canvas he needed for such an immense creation. And so the gentle, winding path of his journey slowly began to turn toward the west. He made the quiet decision to leave Budapest behind, packing his few modest belongings and boarding a train that would carry him toward the bustling, cosmopolitan avenues of Paris. There he hoped to find work within the European offices of Thomas Edison's rapidly expanding electrical empire, believing that among those who were already trying to light the world, he might finally find a place to build the quiet, spinning motor that lived only in his dreams. As the train rolled steadily through the darkened countryside, the rhythmic clacking of the wheels over the iron tracks provided a soothing, endless lullaby. He sat quietly by the window, watching the shadows of the trees slip past in the moonlight, resting comfortably in the knowledge that he was moving closer to his destiny, carrying the invisible light of the future safely within the quiet sanctuary of his own mind. As the gentle, rocking rhythm of the train ride through Europe slowly faded into memory, a much vaster, deeper motion took its place. The young inventor found himself crossing the wide, gray expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, carried across the water by the slow, continuous churning of heavy steam engines. The journey was long and quiet, filled with the endless rhythmic sound of waves breaking against the hull of the ship, a sound that seemed to naturally slow the beating of the heart and quiet the restless wandering of the mind. In the early days of June, in the year 1884, the coastline of a completely different world finally appeared on the hazy horizon. As the ship drifted slowly into the harbor, the skyline of New York City began to reveal itself through the morning mist, a landscape of brick and iron that was already beginning to stretch upward toward the sky. New York was entirely unlike the quiet, misty avenues of Prague or the graceful, aging beauty of Budapest. It was a sprawling, restless metropolis, driven by the ceaseless energy of industry and the loud, metallic clatter of progress. The air was thick and warm with the approaching summer, carrying the heavy scents of coal smoke, roasting chestnuts, and the salty breeze blowing in from the harbor. Into this overwhelming tide of humanity stepped Nikola, a tall, elegantly dressed young man who had arrived in this new country with almost nothing to his name. His pockets held only a few cents, a book of poetry, some mathematical notes, and a single, carefully folded letter of introduction. This letter was addressed to a man whose name was already synonymous with the American electrical age, the pragmatic and fiercely driven Thomas Edison. The meeting between these two brilliant minds was a quiet collision of entirely different worlds. When Nikola finally made his way to Edison's bustling headquarters in Manhattan, he stepped into a space that hummed with a raw, unpolished kind of magic. Edison was a man of the earth, a relentless worker who believed entirely in the power of physical trial and error. He was often found with his sleeves rolled up, his hands stained with oil and carbon, his mind constantly moving from one practical problem to the next. Edison built the future with his bare hands, testing thousands of materials to find the one filament that would glow, tearing things apart and putting them back together until they simply worked. Nikola, on the other hand, was a man of air and light, accustomed to the quiet, pristine theaters of his own imagination. He did not build a machine until it was already fully formed and flawlessly turning in his mind, every friction point calculated, every dimension perfectly balanced. He was impeccably dressed, soft-spoken, and deeply theoretical, carrying a European formality that contrasted sharply with Edison's gruff, straightforward American pragmatism. Yet despite these profound differences, Edison recognized the undeniable brilliance in the young man standing before him, and he offered him a place within his rapidly growing electrical empire. For the next several months, Nikola immersed himself entirely in the demanding, exhausting rhythm of Edison's laboratory. It was a fascinating, overwhelming environment, a particular kind of American place where the gas lamps hissed softly overhead and the air was heavy with the smell of warm metal, machine oil, and melting wax. The rooms were crowded with belts, pulleys, and heavy iron dynamos, all vibrating with the steady, continuous generation of direct current. Here, Nikola worked with an almost superhuman endurance, often arriving before the sun had risen and staying long past midnight, quietly repairing and improving the machines that illuminated the city streets. He worked with a calm, methodical grace, his long, delicate fingers moving easily among the heavy gears and copper wires, finding solutions to mechanical problems that had baffled Edison's most experienced engineers. The two men developed a mutual, if somewhat strained, admiration for one another. Edison marveled at the young European's tireless work ethic and his seemingly boundless technical knowledge, while Nikola deeply respected Edison's sheer force of will and his ability to bring inventions into physical existence. But beneath this shared dedication to electricity, there lay a fundamental, unbridgeable philosophical divide. Edison had built his entire empire upon the foundation of direct current, a system that required a continuous, forced flow of energy, heavy wires, and numerous power stations to push the electricity over even short distances. Nikola, carrying the quiet spinning vision of the alternating current motor in his mind, knew that there was a far more elegant, natural way to move energy across the world, allowing it to flow and reverse like the gentle breathing of the ocean tides. This underlying incompatibility eventually brought their brief partnership to a quiet, inevitable end. Edison's direct current generators were often highly inefficient, prone to breaking down and losing significant amounts of energy. Recognizing the young man's extraordinary abilities, Edison casually offered a reward of $50,000 if Nikola could completely redesign and improve the dynamos. Taking the older man at his exact word, Nikola retreated into a period of intense, solitary focus. For the better part of a year, he poured his mind and body into the task, working quietly through the long, lonely hours of the night, systematically rebuilding Edison's machines until they ran with a smooth, unprecedented efficiency. When the work was finally complete and the redesigned generators were humming perfectly in the laboratory, Nikola approached Edison to claim the promised reward. But the grand promise of wealth had simply been a rough, casual figure of speech, a piece of American humor that did not translate into the literal, formal world from which Nikola had come. Edison informed him, with a dismissive wave of his hand, that the money did not exist, suggesting instead a small raise in his weekly wages. There was no dramatic argument, no raised voices or bitter confrontation. There was only a profound and quiet realization that they were speaking two entirely different languages, standing on opposite sides of a vast, invisible chasm. The young inventor simply nodded, gathered his coat and his few belongings, and quietly walked out of the laboratory, leaving the gaslit world of Thomas Edison behind him forever. He stepped back out into the wide, uncertain streets of New York, carrying his pride and his unbroken visions with him into the cooling air. The months that followed this quiet departure were some of the most challenging and humbling of his entire life. Unable to find investors who truly understood the vast potential of his alternating current designs, and facing the immediate, pressing need to simply survive, he was forced to turn away from the elegant world of mathematics and engineering. As the bitter winter slowly descended over the city, covering the stone streets in a heavy layer of snow and ice, the man who held the future of global energy in his mind found himself holding a heavy iron shovel. He spent the long, freezing winter digging ditches for the city's expanding electrical and telegraph networks, working for just $2 a day. It is a profoundly moving image to hold in your mind this slender, brilliant man standing in the cold, wet earth, his hands blistered and aching from the heavy, repetitive labor, while the grand, sweeping ideas of a connected world continued to turn flawlessly in his imagination. Yet even in this time of physical hardship, there was a quiet, unshakable dignity about him. He did not succumb to despair, nor did he let the harshness of the winter extinguish the light that burned so clearly within him. He simply endured, moving the earth one shovelful at a time, patiently waiting for the season to change, knowing with absolute certainty that his time would eventually come. And as the cold earth slowly thawed and the gentle warmth of the spring finally returned to the city, the heavy wheel of fortune began to turn in his favor. Word of his extraordinary intellect and his quiet, dignified labor had gradually reached the ears of men with the resources to help him. A group of investors, recognizing the immense, untapped potential of his ideas, came forward to offer their support. In the year 1887, the quiet struggles of the ditch-digging winter were left behind, and the Tesla Electric Company was officially formed. He was finally given a space of his own, a quiet, well-lit laboratory in Manhattan, where the air was free from the heavy, practical demands of Edison's direct current empire. Here, surrounded by clean workbenches, fresh spools of copper wire, and the soft, steady light of the afternoon sun filtering through the windows, he could finally begin to bring his dreams into the physical world. The long, winding path that had started in the small mountain village of Smiljan carried him through the ancient streets of Europe and tested him in the cold trenches of New York, had finally brought him to a place of rest and quiet determination. As we leave him standing in his new laboratory, watching the dust motes dance in the late afternoon light, we can feel the deep, comforting sense of a long journey arriving safely at its destination. You too can allow your mind to rest in this warm, secure space, feeling the satisfying weight of a struggle overcome, letting the peaceful quiet of the room gently guide you further down into a deep, unbroken sleep. The quiet, sunlit laboratory in the heart of Manhattan slowly began to yield the physical proof of his long-held, invisible visions. It was here, surrounded by the comforting metallic scent of copper wire, the faint clean odor of ozone, and the soft, steady hum of early prototypes, that his path quietly intersected with a man who could truly understand the profound magnitude of his ideas. George Westinghouse was a man of industry, a prominent builder of railway brakes and heavy machinery. Yet beneath his robust, practical exterior, he possessed a mind that was remarkably open to the subtle, unseen possibilities of the future. When Westinghouse first visited the tranquil workspace and watched the alternating current motor spinning flawlessly on the wooden workbench, There was no need for long, forceful arguments or elaborate, persuasive demonstrations. He simply observed the elegant, friction-free dance of the invisible magnetic fields, and he knew instantly, with a deep, quiet certainty, that he was looking at the future of human energy. The two men, coming from entirely different worlds, formed a partnership that was rooted in a shared, unspoken conviction, seamlessly blending the young inventor's ethereal, mathematical brilliance with Westinghouse's grounded, steady capacity to build and manufacture on a grand scale. This partnership gently set into motion what history would later dramatically call the War of Currents, though to the man who had designed the system, it never truly felt like a war at all. While the corporate giants of the era engaged in slow, heavy institutional negotiations, loudly debating the merits of Edison's continuous direct current against the flowing, reversing tides of alternating current, Nikola largely remained a quiet, detached observer. He was insulated within the peaceful, protective walls of his own thoughts and his laboratory, entirely removed from the aggressive, public posturing of the business world. The world outside was filled with the noisy, soot-stained realities of early direct current, a system that required loud, coal-burning power stations in nearly every neighborhood, pushing electricity through thick, heavy cables over very short distances. It was a messy, localized, and profoundly limited way to light a city. He understood, with the calm clarity of a natural philosopher, that this forced method was fundamentally flawed. His own design, by contrast, allowed energy to flow organically and gracefully, moving forward and backward in a natural oscillating rhythm, much like the slow, rhythmic drawing of a deep breath or the gentle pushing and pulling of the ocean tides. Because it could be stepped up to high voltages for travel and stepped down for safe use in a home, it could cross entire continents using thin, elegant wires. He spent these years not arguing with rivals but quietly refining his creations, trusting with a quiet and absolute faith that the world would eventually recognize the gentle, undeniable superiority of this natural, effortless flow. And the world's eventual recognition did arrive, unfolding on a grand, breathtaking scale in the mild, fragrant summer of 1893, softly illuminating the sprawling grounds of the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition. It was an event of entirely unprecedented ambition, a vast, temporary city built of white plaster and grand classical architecture, designed specifically to showcase the absolute pinnacle of human achievement to millions of wandering visitors. George Westinghouse and his brilliant partner had been chosen to provide the electrical power for the entire fair, an undertaking of monumental proportions that required the seamless orchestration of massive alternating current generators. If you close your eyes and let your imagination drift back to those warm, unhurried summer evenings, you can almost picture the vast crowds gathering quietly along the edges of the grand, artificial canals. The water would lap softly against the stone edges as families and travelers, arriving from every corner of the globe, waited for the long twilight to fade completely into the true enveloping darkness of the night. As the evening shadows deepened across the grand lawns and the sky turned a rich, dark indigo, a series of heavy brass switches were slowly and deliberately engaged in the central power hall. And then, in a beautiful, silent wave of energy, hundreds of thousands of incandescent glass bulbs began to glow. They painted the neoclassical facades, the broad walkways, and the still, reflecting pools in a soft, unbroken blanket of brilliant, warm white light. The fairgrounds were instantly transformed from a dark, shadowed park into a radiant, glowing dreamscape, completely banishing the ancient heavy darkness of night, with a gentle, steady illumination that the world had never before witnessed on such a massive, collective scale. You could hear the faint, distant strains of orchestras playing softly in the pavilions, perfectly mingling with the low, reassuring hum of the hidden generators. The crowds fell into a hushed, reverent awe, standing closely together beneath the softly glowing arches, their faces warmly illuminated by the invisible energy that the young inventor had first seen while watching a sunset in a distant park so many years ago. It was a moment of profound, quiet triumph. The physical, glowing manifestation of a dream that had been carried carefully across oceans and quietly nurtured through long, solitary, freezing winters. Yet, even as the glowing white city of the fair gently faded into memory, An even greater, more permanent realization of his lifelong vision was already beginning to take shape in the natural world. Far to the north and west, where the vast ancient waters of the Great Lakes empty relentlessly into the deep gorge of the Niagara River, an ambitious, staggering project was underway to harness the raw, terrifying power of the falling water. Since his early, quiet childhood, reading old volumes about the immense waterfalls of the distant world, he had dreamed of simply placing a wheel beneath the rushing, continuous currents to peacefully capture their unyielding strength. Now, that quiet, childhood dream was being carefully translated into deep, echoing chambers of stone, iron, and heavy copper wire. Deep within the bedrock beside the mighty falls, massive alternating current generators, designed strictly according to his exact theoretical principles, were being slowly and painstakingly installed. If you can, imagine the profound, icy stillness of the deep winter at Niagara during those years of construction. The freezing mist rising from the falls, slowly coating the surrounding trees and heavy iron railings in a thick, brilliant layer of smooth, white ice. The air outside was chaotic, freezing, and wildly alive with the deafening roar of millions of gallons of water plunging downward into the gorge. But inside the subterranean, man-made caverns of the power station, the atmosphere was a sanctuary of warm, orderly, and beautiful mathematics. The air was heavy with the smell of warm copper and the deep, continuous vibration of the turbines, a sound so immense, low, and constant that it felt like the very heartbeat of the Earth itself. When the great, heavy turbines finally began to turn in 1895, they did not fight the crushing weight of the water. They simply borrowed its endless, falling momentum with a smooth, graceful acceptance. They transformed the raw, ancient gravity of nature into an invisible, flowing, alternating current of electricity. This immense silent power was then sent traveling quietly through miles of suspended copper wire, humming softly over the dark, sleeping pine forests and the vast snow-covered fields until it reached the city of Buffalo, softly illuminating the streets, factories, and homes of a city 20 miles away from the roaring source of the power. It was a breathtaking, paradigm-shifting achievement, a quiet and monumental turning point in the history of human civilization. It proved once and for all that energy could be gathered gently from the wild forces of nature and sent invisibly across vast, open distances to quietly light the darkest, most isolated corners of the world. In the midst of this towering historical success, however, the heavy, practical, and often unforgiving realities of the corporate business world threatened to quietly dismantle everything they had worked so hard to build. The Westinghouse Company, heavily overextended by the massive financial costs of constructing these pioneering, unprecedented projects, gradually found itself facing the quiet, looming, and very heavy shadow of total financial ruin. The powerful bankers and investors demanded a severe, uncompromising restructuring of the company's massive debts in order to keep it alive. And at the very center of their rigid concerns was the incredibly generous royalty contract that George Westinghouse had signed with the young inventor several years before. Under the explicit terms of that formal agreement, Nikola was legally entitled to a small, continuous payment for every single unit of alternating current electricity that was generated and sold. Because his system was rapidly and undeniably becoming the absolute standard for the entire globe, this single, simple contract was poised to make him, within a very short time, one of the wealthiest individuals in the entire history of the modern world. When George Westinghouse, burdened by the immense stress of his failing empire, arrived at the quiet sanctuary of the Manhattan laboratory to gently and apologetically explain the dire financial situation, the response he received from the solitary inventor was not one of anger or complex negotiation or bitter, frustrated disappointment. Nikola listened quietly, completely still, his mind comfortably and permanently unbothered by the complex artificial mathematics of immense wealth and corporate survival. He looked at the older man standing before him, the man who had believed in his abstract vision when almost no one else in the world would, the man who had faithfully helped him bring the alternating current motor out of the quiet isolation of his imagination and into the noisy physical world. Without a single moment of hesitation, without asking for time to consult with lawyers or to weigh the staggering financial cost of his actions, Nikola simply asked for the contract. He took the heavy, formal paper, the very document that guaranteed him unimaginable, endless riches, and he quietly, deliberately tore it into pieces. He gave away his legal claim to an immense, world-altering fortune as easily and naturally as one might let go of a dry autumn leaf, watching it fall gently into a moving river and float quietly away out of sight. For him, the true lasting reward had never been the accumulation of paper money, the acquisition of grand estates, or the endless pursuit of corporate power. The true reward was the pure, solitary, unadulterated joy of the creation itself. It was the profound, soul-deep satisfaction of knowing that he had built a system that would effortlessly, reliably light the homes of millions of people he would never meet, warming rooms and banishing the dark long after he was gone. He chose the smooth, uninterrupted flow of his life's work over the heavy, burdensome weight of unimaginable wealth, ensuring that the company would survive and that the alternating current would continue to spread softly across the continents. Standing quietly at the very height of his era, enveloped in the soft electric glow of his own remarkable creation, he felt an immense, peaceful lightness. He was perfectly content to remain exactly who he was, a man devoted entirely to the gentle, illuminating, and ever-expanding mysteries of light. As the evening slowly settles around you now, allow your own thoughts to emulate this profound, beautiful letting go. Release any heavy burdens, lingering thoughts, or complex worries you might be holding from your own day, letting them drift away like small pieces of paper on the soft night wind, and allow yourself to sink further into the warm, comforting, and brilliantly quiet dark. As the grand, public triumphs of the world's Columbian Exposition and the immense power station at Niagara Falls slowly settled into the enduring fabric of history, the quiet trajectory of his life turned gently back inward. It was a slow, deliberate turning away from the crowded stages of the world, returning him to the comforting sanctuary of his own private workspace. The Houston Street Laboratory, situated in the bustling heart of Manhattan during the mid to late 1890s, was entirely unlike the heavy, echoing stone caverns of the power plants. It was an intimate, beautifully mysterious space, filled with a delicate, otherworldly atmosphere that seemed to exist completely outside the ordinary flow of time. If you were to walk down the quiet stairs from the street level and step softly through the heavy wooden door late at night, you would find yourself enveloped in a warm, humming twilight. The air inside carried a distinct, metallic sweetness, the clean, sharp scent of ozone mixing softly with the smell of warm machine oil, melting wax, and the dry, familiar comfort of old paper. Here, in the deeply quiet hours long after the city above had gone to sleep, he worked completely alone, surrounded by the soft, steady cycling of heavy generators and the breathtaking ambient light of his own creations. The laboratory was illuminated not by the harsh glare of street lamps or the flickering, uneven yellow of gaslight, but by the ethereal, ghostly glow of intricate glass tubes. These delicate, hand-blown vessels, filled with rare gases and absent of any connecting wires, radiated soft hues of deep violet, pale blue, and warm sea green. They rested quietly on cluttered wooden workbenches, shedding a gentle, dreamlike luminescence over the rumpled stacks of mathematical notes, the half-empty cups of cold coffee, and the complex, beautiful geometry of copper coils. He would often sit perfectly still in a heavy wooden chair for hours, his hands folded in his lap, simply watching the light as it pulsed and shifted, a solitary man keeping watch over the quiet birth of the future. It was within this peaceful, glowing solitude that he began to push the boundaries of the known world even further, reaching gently into the unseen spectrums of energy and light. During these long, undisturbed nights, his mind wandered freely through the invisible architecture of the universe, exploring the subtle, unseen frequencies that bind the natural world together. Long before the scientific community would officially announce the discovery of the X-ray, he was quietly observing the pale, haunting fluorescence of high-frequency electrical currents casting shadow images onto photographic plates. He was experimenting with the early foundational whispers of radio frequency transmission, sending invisible waves of energy traveling silently through the air of the laboratory, proving to himself that communication and power did not need to be tethered to the earth by heavy iron wires. He saw a future where the atmosphere itself could carry the voices, the music, and the light of humanity, envisioning a vast, invisible ocean of energy waiting patiently to be harnessed. Occasionally, he would open the doors of this quiet sanctuary to a select group of close friends and curious visitors, offering them a gentle, mesmerizing glimpse into the beautiful world he was building. These private demonstrations were not boastful displays of power, but rather quiet, poetic unveilings of natural philosophy. He would stand calmly in the center of the room, dressed impeccably in his dark evening clothes, and allow hundreds of thousands of volts of high-frequency electricity to pass harmlessly through his own body, his long, delicate fingertips softly illuminating glass tubes that he held freely in his hands. The visitors would sit in the dim, humming light, watching with a hushed, reverent awe as electrical arcs danced like soft, captive lightning around the room, moving with the graceful, fluid elegance of water. To those who witnessed these quiet, glowing evenings, it often felt as though the boundary between rigorous science and pure, ancient magic had completely dissolved, leaving only a profound sense of wonder. Yet, the quiet, steady rhythm of this deeply creative period was eventually met by a moment of profound and unexpected sorrow. In the early freezing hours of a March morning in 1895, while the city was still firmly held in the dark grasp of winter, a quiet tragedy unfolded that would forever alter the landscape of his work. A fire, starting softly and moving with a devastating silent hunger, swept through the Houston Street building. By the time the sun slowly rose to illuminate the cold morning, the entire laboratory, the glowing glass tubes, the intricate copper coils, the carefully written journals containing years of unrecoverable thoughts, and the delicate machinery of his grandest dreams, had all been reduced to a heavy smoldering layer of gray ash. The air, once sweet with ozone, was now thick with the scent of wet, burned wood and the profound silence of destroyed machinery. It was a staggering, unimaginable loss, the quiet erasure of thousands of solitary hours and a vast library of unseen potential, all vanishing completely into the cold winter air. He did not cry out, and he did not rage against the turning of the wheel. The profound loss was met with a deep, consuming silence. For several heavy weeks following the fire, he retreated entirely into the solitary quiet of his hotel room, drawing the curtains against the light of the day, unable to face the empty, scorched space where his dreams had once lived. If you can, imagine the profound stillness of a mind that has lost the physical anchors of its own immense creativity, the quiet mourning of a man who watches a beautiful, intricately built world simply wash away. It is a feeling of deep exhausted surrender, a moment when the only thing left to do is to rest, to allow the heavy weight of the loss to settle gently into the earth, and to wait patiently for the slow, inevitable return of the light. Allow yourself to breathe softly into that same quiet space, letting go of whatever you might be holding tightly, and trusting the natural restorative rhythm of the quiet dark. Gradually, as the cold winds of the winter slowly gave way to the softening air of the spring, the deeply ingrained resilience of his nature began to gently pull him forward once again. A new laboratory was eventually secured, new spools of bare copper wire were purchased, and the slow, methodical process of rebuilding the lost machinery quietly began. But the fire had shifted something fundamental within his spirit, leaving a lasting, subtle mark upon the shape of his days. As he recreated his work, reaching back into the vast, untouched archives of his own flawless memory to redraw the blueprints that had turned to ash, he began to turn further and further away from the noisy, demanding expectations of the outside world. The vibrant, social energy that had occasionally brought prominent visitors to his door began to slowly fade, replaced by a deepening, comfortable isolation. His personal habits grew more rigidly defined, a set of quiet, numerical rituals that offered a sense of order and control in a world that had proven to be deeply fragile. He began to dine alone, requesting specific, quiet tables in the corners of dining rooms, counting his steps as he walked the city pavements, and finding a deep, necessary comfort in the predictable rhythm of routine. He was slowly becoming a man who existed almost entirely within the quiet, boundless architecture of his own mind. A solitary architect of the future who was increasingly content to leave the present world behind. As the years of the late 1890s drifted softly by, the newly built laboratory, humming once again with the low, steady vibration of alternating current generators, became a quiet island in the midst of the roaring city. The work continued, the intricate theories deepened, and the beautiful violet light of the gas tubes returned to softly illuminate the long, solitary nights. But the focus of his grand imagination was slowly beginning to shift toward the vast open skies, dreaming of a project so immense and so beautiful that it would require him to eventually leave the sheltered quiet of the laboratory and step out into the wide, lonely expanse of the open world. As we prepare to follow him out into that quiet distance, let your own mind continue to soften and rest, enveloped safely in the gentle, protective hum of the fading evening, drifting ever closer to a deep, undisturbed sleep. As the turn of the century softly approached, the familiar confines of the Manhattan laboratory, no matter how brilliantly illuminated by his creations, could no longer contain the sheer expanding scale of his imagination. He needed a landscape as vast and open as his own thoughts, a place where the dense physical boundaries of the city would not interfere with the immense forces he was now seeking to quietly understand. And so, in the mild spring of 1899, the gentle trajectory of his life carried him far away from the crowded, cobblestone streets of the East Coast, guiding him toward the high, pristine altitudes of Colorado Springs. There, settled peacefully in the wide-open shadow of Pikes Peak, he built an extraordinary experimental station on the edge of the sprawling prairie, a large, wooden structure with a tall mast reaching up like a solitary finger pointing directly into the endless western sky. The air in Colorado was entirely different from the thick, ocean-heavy atmosphere of New York. It was thin, crisp, and incredibly dry, making it a perfect canvas for the passage of electrical currents. Here, surrounded by the deep, unbroken quiet of the mountains and the vast, rolling plains, he began to work with high voltages on a scale that had never before been attempted. He was no longer simply lighting delicate glass tubes. He was creating rolling, resonant waves of energy that rippled gently through the very earth itself. At night, he would stand beneath the sprawling, unbroken canopy of stars, sending massive, artificial bolts of lightning arching beautifully into the dark sky, listening as the soft, low thunder of his creations rolled endlessly across the sleeping prairie. It was during these lonely, high-altitude nights, while sitting quietly beside his deeply sensitive receiving equipment, that he noticed something profound and entirely unexpected. In the profound stillness of the laboratory, his instruments began to pick up a series of faint, rhythmic electrical signals, a pattern of subtle pulses that were far too regular, too perfectly spaced to be the random, chaotic noise of a distant storm. As he listened to the soft, continuous clicking in the dark, his mind, always open to the absolute vastness of the universe, arrived at a deeply poetic conclusion. He believed, with a quiet, reverent sense of awe, that he was listening to the gentle, electrical murmurs of another world. He felt that he was catching the faint, drifting whispers of neighboring planets across the vast, dark ocean of space. While history and later science might interpret those wandering signals differently, there's a profound, breathtaking beauty in the image of this solitary man sitting alone on the quiet edge of the American frontier holding a peaceful, silent conversation with the stars. He returned to New York at the dawn of the 20th century, carrying the weight of these immense, boundless possibilities within him. His mind fixed firmly on a singular, breathtaking vision. He no longer wanted to simply power a single city or illuminate a stretch of road. He dreamed of a world entirely connected, a globe enveloped in a continuous, invisible web of energy and communication. He envisioned a gentle, harmonious system where a person standing in the most isolated, remote corner of the earth could carry a small, simple device and pull music, spoken voices, and unlimited electrical power directly from the air around them, just as naturally and effortlessly as drawing water from a flowing river. To bring this grand, beautiful dream into physical reality, he secured the financial backing of J.P. Morgan, one of the most powerful and pragmatic men of the era, and set to work on the greatest, most ambitious project of his life. On a quiet, sweeping stretch of land on Long Island, near the soft, rhythmic lapping of the Atlantic Ocean, the grand facility of Wardenclyffe began to slowly rise. It was a structure of strange, intricate, and deeply deliberate beauty. A magnificent, 8-sided wooden lattice tower climbed slowly and steadily toward the clouds, designed carefully without the use of a single piece of iron that might interfere with the flow of the currents. Beneath the earth, Deep copper shafts burrowed hundreds of feet into the ground, gripping the planet like the heavy, hidden roots of a massive, ancient tree. Wardenclyffe was not merely a building. It was intended to be a giant, resonant instrument, built to pluck the very strings of the earth and send vibrations traveling softly across the oceans and continents. If you close your eyes and picture it now, you can almost see the tower standing tall and quiet against the backdrop of a soft, gray coastal morning. The smell of the salty ocean mist mingling with the scent of fresh-cut lumber and the damp, overturned earth hangs peacefully in the air. You can see him walking slowly across the grounds in his long, dark coat, watching the heavy wooden beams being carefully lifted into place, his mind already living comfortably in the fully connected, harmonious future he was so certain he was building. It is a deeply moving picture of human ambition, a man trying gently and earnestly to hand the entire world a beautiful gift of limitless and visible grace. But the heavy practical realities of the present world are often uniquely resistant to the sweeping ethereal dreams of the future. As the construction at Wardenclyffe slowly progressed, stretching across the early years of the 1900s, the immense financial costs of the project began to steadily and quietly mount. The world of early radio communication was beginning to move in a different, much simpler direction, favoring small, localized transmissions over the grand, global resonance he was attempting to achieve. Morgan, unable to see the practical, immediate return on such an abstract, monumental investment, quietly but firmly withdrew his financial support. The stopping of the work did not happen all at once in a dramatic, sudden crash. It was, rather, a slow, quiet receding of the tide. The laborers gradually packed away their tools and departed. The hum of the machinery in the brick laboratory slowly faded into silence, and the tall wooden tower was left standing alone in the coastal wind, unfinished and profoundly still. He fought quietly and tirelessly for years to find new supporters, writing hundreds of letters, gently pleading with the world to understand the vast, unrealized potential of the dormant giant on the Long Island shore. But the world had already begun to turn its attention elsewhere, moving forward into a noisier, more fragmented century, leaving the quiet, comprehensive elegance of his vision slowly behind in the mist. In the end, burdened by mounting debts and the inescapable gravity of financial ruin, the land was taken away, and the beautiful, unfinished dream of Wardenclyffe was quietly foreclosed upon. In the year 1917, the magnificent wooden lattice tower was finally ordered to be dismantled. It was taken down quietly, piece by piece, falling back to the earth and disappearing entirely into the deep, undisturbed folds of history. For the man who had designed it, the loss of the tower was not merely a financial failure. It was the quiet closing of a door to a future he had already lived within. He had always held his inventions entirely in his mind before building them, and so, in his rich internal world, Wardenclyffe had already been functioning perfectly for years. He had already heard the voices traveling through the air, already seen the unlimited power glowing in distant, isolated homes. To watch the physical structure be dismantled was to quietly watch the rest of humanity turn away from a beautiful gift he had tried so desperately to offer. Yet, he did not allow this profound disappointment to turn his heart toward resentment. He carried the grief of it with a quiet, dignified grace, retreating further into the vast, untouched sanctuary of his own thoughts. His mind remained a place of flawless geometry and endless, elegant possibilities. A place where the currents still flowed perfectly, completely unaffected by the limitations of the waking world. When we look back upon the slow vanishing of this incredible dream across the long, sweeping field of time, there is no need for bitterness or sorrow at the way the world unfolded. There is only a kind of wistful, accepting peace, a quiet acknowledgement that some visions are simply too vast, too beautifully generous for the era in which they are born. As you rest here in the comforting dark, allow the gentle fading of this grand dream to remind you that not everything we build is meant to be finished, and not every journey must end exactly where we intended. It is perfectly fine to let go of the heavy structures we have tried to carry, to watch them slowly dismantle and fade away into the past. Release your own unfulfilled plans and quiet disappointments, letting them drift away on the soft, nighttime breeze. Just as the wooden beams of the tower eventually vanished from the shore, you are left only with the quiet, empty sky, the gentle sound of the distant ocean, and the peaceful, uninterrupted calm of deep, restorative rest. The years that followed the quiet dismantling of his grandest dream did not bring a frantic, restless search for lost glory. Instead, as the roaring 20th century accelerated around him, filling the skies with new airplanes and the streets with the loud rush of automobiles, his own path quietly and gracefully narrowed. In 1933, seeking a permanent and peaceful retreat, he moved into the towering heights of the Hotel New Yorker, taking up residence in a modest, comfortable suite of rooms on the 33rd floor. If you can, imagine the comforting, deeply predictable atmosphere of that grand old hotel in the late hours of the night. You can almost see the polished brass doors of the elevator gliding softly and silently, shut the muted, heavy floral carpets of the long corridors, absorbing the sound of every footstep, the faint, comforting scent of floor wax and old paper, and the warm amber glow of the wall sconces casting gentle, motionless shadows along the walls. His room became a sanctuary entirely suspended out of time, far above the restless, endless noise of the city. Down below, the streets hummed continuously with the very alternating current he had given to the world. But up here in the quiet, sheltering dark, there was only the slow, steady ticking of a bedside clock and the soft whistling of the wind, gently pressing against the cold glass of the window. He was an older man now, his frame thinner and more fragile, his dark hair turned to a soft, distinguished silver. But he carried himself with the exact same impeccable grace and quiet dignity he had always possessed. His hands, those long, elegant, and incredibly sensitive instruments that had once assembled the unseen future, now moved with a slower, more deliberate care. He lived a life of small, comforting consistencies that gently anchored him to the slow turning of the days. His meals were simple, strictly vegetarian, and always brought directly to his room, where he would arrange the plates in silver with a precise, quiet geometry that pleased his orderly mind. He found a deep, sustaining peace in these gentle, repetitive routines. The vast, sweeping ambitions that had once spanned oceans and continents had slowly, beautifully distilled into a calm, daily rhythm. He still read extensively, his vast memory as flawless as it had been in his youth, holding entire volumes of poetry and philosophy with effortless grace. He still filled pages with beautiful, complex mathematics, dreaming up abstract theories of particle beams and invisible protective walls of energy. But there was no longer any urgent, burning need to build them. They were simply thoughts, released quietly back into the universe. He was quietly watching the world catch up to the distant horizons he had drawn decades before, perfectly content to let new names in younger hands carry the heavy, practical burdens of construction. His most cherished hours in these fading years were not spent among the wealthy investors or the prominent scientists of the era, but rather in the quiet, open green spaces of the city. Every single day, regardless of the shifting seasons or the weather, he would put on his long dark overcoat and his traditional fedora and take a slow, unhurried walk to the nearby public library or to the leafy pathways of Bryant Park. He always carried with him small, carefully prepared paper bags filled with seeds. There, amidst the old stone monuments and the softly rustling leaves, he enacted a daily ritual of profound, unspoken tenderness. He went to feed the pigeons. To see him there, a solitary, distinguished figure standing softly in the morning light surrounded by the gentle, rhythmic fluttering of hundreds of wings, is to see a man who had made absolute, quiet peace with his place in the cosmos. He spoke to the birds softly, his voice a low, reassuring murmur, treating them with the exact same deep respect and careful attention he had once given to the great invisible forces of nature. They were small, delicate lives, and he found an immense, comforting joy in simply ensuring they were fed, sheltered, and safe from the cold. Among these countless, gathering birds, there was one who held a very special, quiet corner of his heart. She was a beautiful female pigeon, pure white with only the faintest, subtle touches of pale gray upon the very tips of her wings. She seemed to understand him in a way that transcended ordinary communication. She would come to visit him, not just in the park, but at the high window of his room on the 33rd floor. He would leave the window open just a crack in the evenings, letting the cool, damp air slip inside, and she would fly down from the darkening, vast sky to rest quietly on his sill. He spoke of her to his few remaining friends with a profound and poetic affection, feeling that, as long as she came to him, his life still held a beautiful, undeniable purpose. Imagine the profound, quiet intimacy of that scene. The room bathed in the soft, low light of a single reading lamp, the distant muffled hum of the city far below sounding like a gentle ocean, and the old inventor sitting perfectly still in his comfortable chair, watching the white bird preen her feathers in the shadows. He would gently reach out his aged, trembling hand to offer her a few seeds, feeling the impossibly light, delicate touch of her beak against his skin. The hands that had once channeled thousands of volts of roaring electricity, that had drawn the blueprint for a new world in the dirt of a park, were now gently holding resting places for tired wings. In these slow, fading years, the physical world around him was gently thinning out, becoming less demanding, less urgent, and far more ethereal. The loud, heavy, metallic machinery of his youth had been entirely replaced by the soft rustle of feathers and the quiet, continuous turning of pages. He took long, solitary walks late at night, stepping out into the crisp air long after the theaters had emptied and the hurried crowds had gone to sleep, wandering slowly through the illuminated, silent canyons of Manhattan. He would look up at the street lamps, casting pools of warm, steady white light onto the empty stone sidewalks, knowing intimately the invisible, humming journey the electricity had taken to arrive there. He did not feel forgotten, nor did he feel any bitter resentment toward a world that rarely recognized his face on the street anymore. He felt only the quiet, satisfying warmth of a life that had been spent entirely in the pursuit of light. He had done exactly what he had set out to do, and the world was brighter because he had been there. As you listen to the steady, unhurried rhythm of his final, peaceful years, let your own breathing fall gently into that same slow, restful cadence. The day is over. The heavy tasks, the grand ambitions, the anxious need to build or fix or achieve, they can all be gently set aside, left resting quietly by the door. You are safe in this quiet room, resting warmly in the dark, where the only sounds are the soft, rhythmic breathing of the night, and the distant, comforting, invisible hum of the world continuing on its own. The mind that once held the entire, breathless future now rests easily in the present moment, watching a white bird on a quiet windowsill. Allow your own thoughts to become just as simple, just as quiet, and just as light. The sentences are becoming shorter, the pauses are growing longer. There is absolutely nothing more to solve. There is only the soft bed, the warm gathering shadows, and the beautiful, dignified peace of a long, full day finally coming to a close. On the quiet, profoundly still night of January 7th, 1943, while the vast expanse of New York City was wrapped safely in the freezing embrace of the deep winter, the long, extraordinary journey of Nikola Tesla came to a peaceful, natural close. In the deeply familiar, comforting sanctuary of his room on the 33rd floor of the Hotel New Yorker, the man who had dreamed the modern world into existence simply went to sleep. He was 86 years old. There was no struggle in this departure, no dramatic final realization, and no lingering sorrow. It was only a gentle, completely natural slipping away into the winter dark, very much like a soft, solitary light slowly and peacefully fading into a much deeper, comforting rest. He left the physical world exactly as he had moved through it for so many decades, solitary, quiet, surrounded by the invisible atmosphere of his own thoughts, and perfectly at peace. For a long while after his passing, the noisy, endlessly hurried world seemed to slowly, almost carelessly, forget the gentle, soft-spoken architect of its own foundation. As the mid-century accelerated, his name gently drifted into the quiet, undisturbed margins of history, resting there in the shadows while the sprawling era he had originally envisioned rushed loudly and relentlessly forward. But history, much like the smooth, reversing flow of his own beloved alternating current, has a beautiful way of eventually returning to where it belongs. Gradually, as the world grew more and more entirely dependent upon the invisible oceans of energy and the deeply connected wireless skies he had first imagined in the isolated silence of his youth, his memory began to beautifully and rightfully return to the light. Today, you do not need to look very far, nor do you need to travel to grand museums or read heavy, dusty textbooks to find the profound, lingering grace of his life's work. It is already here with you. It is woven seamlessly and continuously into the very fabric of the room you are resting in right now. It lives in the soft, glowing bulb that you turned off just before closing your heavy eyes. It is present in the small, silent devices resting quietly on your nightstand, pulling invisible, weightless signals from the open air, exactly as he knew, with absolute certainty, they one day would. It is in the low, steady warmth of the walls surrounding you, and in the bright, humming arteries of every city on the globe. You see, the true, lasting quality of his immense gift was never genuinely about the pursuit of personal wealth, the securing of rigid ownership, or the fleeting desire to see his name carved deeply into heavy stone monuments. His gift was always the pure, unadulterated essence of the thing itself. It was the light. It was a brilliant, invisible power, given away freely, generously, and without condition, released from the quiet confines of his own mind, so that it could belong entirely to you and to the rest of the world. And now, as this story slowly and finally draws to its gentle close, let your own mind release any remaining, lingering hold on the waking world. The long journey is over. There is absolutely nothing left to build, nothing left to carry, and nothing left for you to do. Feel the heavy, deeply comforting weight of the darkness wrapping safely around your shoulders, holding you completely secure in this present moment. Breathe in the slow, easy, unbroken quiet of the night, and let every single muscle in your body sink completely and effortlessly into the soft, welcoming surface beneath you. Imagine the vast sleeping city outside your window, or the quiet snow-covered fields resting peacefully beneath the turning stars illuminated softly by millions of gentle, distant lights that all trace their invisible origins back to the mind of one remarkable, solitary man. Let your own thoughts drift outward into that vast, beautifully connected ocean of peace, surrendering entirely to the deep, restorative currents of sleep. And if you listen, just beneath the ordinary silence of tonight, you might almost hear it still. That soft, persistent hum. His gift, still moving through the walls, still lighting the way.